Chapter 44. The very soul of the community, Spiritus Mundi. Chanticleer said that he needed his rest, and then he perched, unsleeping, on the lowest branch in the hemlock. With a baleful eye he looked at, and did not look at, his animals. They were aware of the presence, and the meek among them crept on a snow that had been wind-swept to the crust, looking and not looking at him. They simply did not know what to expect from that riven countenance. There was a black striving and a tension in him, as though a dark sun radiated black light from his thought. They were stricken and uncomfortable. Sometimes the wind would gust great scrolls of snow into the air, and it would catch the creatures from behind, inverting their fur and sneaking to their skins. They were cold, and now, at the returning of the cock, it seemed that the Fimble winter would last forever. They were hopeless. Worse, the wolves that roved the outland borders did so with intent. No longer were they a remote and vaguely disquieting menace. They went with a quicker step now. They showed their fangs to animals who wandered out of the camp. By growling, by the direct threat of the eye, by urinating a pungent, stinging scent, they frightened animals inward to the core of the encampment, which was the hemlock. On four sides the wolves were tightening the territory. It was a siege, for Boreas had said, "The cock is home, and the cock's malingering. Now is the time." In the deadly whiteness of his eye, and by the might of his shoulder, Boreas patrolled the north, and the wind blew cold, and he did not mind. All up and down the western border ran Favonius, and the wind blew, and he sent his howling with it. It was a northwest wind, made powerful on the prairies. And Eurus closed the borders of the east, and Notos lurked to the south. To Notos blew the odors of the animals. Then Notos, more than the others, gnashed his teeth, because he smelled food, and he was hungry, starved, and he was impatient. The least restrained of the pack was the black wolf Notos, and his red eye burned perpetual discontent. To him the wind blew envy, and he was full of craving. Chinook, the grey wolf of long endurance, took the whole circuit round and ran communication among all the wolves. Boreas demanded of her, "Why can't I hear his voice in the south? I know the west and I know the east. I feel three sides but not the fourth. Why doesn't Notos call?" And Chinook said, "His head is low down. He's thinking his own thoughts now." It was a siege of ordered and cunning intent, a noose. And the consequence was that animals pressed inward on one another, slowly, hardly noticing the cramping of their numbers, yet suffering the distress of it none the less. Close quarters nerved them. But Chanticleer had said that he needed his rest. He perched on his branch, doing nothing. And Perlote had lost her will to care for or console the animals. Not even her sweet voice sang faith to their souls, nor did she try to control their selfish behavior. She had tried once more to talk with Chanticleer. She had tried to explain her rejection at their meeting, that it wasn't rejection, though it seemed to be, and that she loved him still. He had listened in silence, and then demanded again the kiss, but she couldn't kiss him. She couldn't bring herself to kiss him, dear God, but this time it wasn't only the obscenity of parasites that disabled her. It was that he demanded, and it was the cold scrutiny of that demand. So then he had dismissed her, saying that he needed his sleep, and she had gone to the wall behind the hemlock and wrapped herself in her wings and grieved. Tomorrow she might rise up again. Tomorrow she might find love for the animals again, and faith to console them. She was a woman of deep capacities. She had survived unspeakable shocks to the soul. But today, she grieved and had to seek healing for herself. Therefore she did not go to or discipline the goats when she heard the new eruption of their vulgar language. Nor could she find it in her to comfort the brothers mice, who squealed and squealed but could not stop the goats. And she heard the despoiling of a food bin. She heard the goats break in with their vestigial horns, ruining the food. She heard their goatish outrage at how mean the larder was after all, since they'd believed the best had been kept from them. She heard, but she thought in her sorrow, what could she do? If Chanticleer did nothing, what could she do? His inertia gave the lie to her previous threats. No, he didn't cut them from ear to the shoulder. He was taking his rest. Pertolote felt the trouble of unraveling events. But today she was disabled. There sat Chanticleer on his limb, her husband whom she could not kiss, and below him lay the hollow skull of Mundukani. All she could do was to make her world a tiny place, sufficient for herself alone. She wrapped her wings around her body and grieved. So the animals were left to their own devices, stricken and hopeless and cold, unnerved and hungry, despairing because the Fimbul winter would last forever. They had looked to the blessings of the northward expedition, and then they had looked to the coming of the cock again. He had come, but there was no healing in his wings, so what was left to hope for, and what could change their miserable existence? Chanticleer was taking his rest. Then into this troubled congregation of animals there came a terrible word, which seemed, when it was heard, to name the times like a title underneath the picture, and that word was death. No one was surprised to hear it, but for some it was the end of trusting and the motive to handle matters on their own. For some, the end of faith. For some, the realization of fears. For others, the justification of selfishness. From ear to ear the message blew like a chill wind. Black Pale on a silver field is dead. He never woke up again. He never made another sound. There was a long, harsh rattling in his throat, and then nothing. He died. Was it his time? No, it wasn't his time to die. He was a grand beast, beautiful in his blackness, noble in all his manners, and stronger than most. No one deserves to die, but Black Pale least of all. This is horrible. This is the confounding of everything right or good. This is wrong. Oh, this... All of the eyes, all of the hearts of the animals turned toward Chanticleer. Then, with a true beseeching, they yearned for a crow. They wanted only that he should be their priest, one soul undismayed by the shock of death. He didn't even have to explain death, or this death, just to crow as he had crowed before, just to relieve them and give them leave to break down and cry. He had done that in the wars. He had done that even when the death before them was the death of his own children. He knew how to crow the crow of grief. It was not unnatural that they should look to him. Now, today, all helpless in a nearly universal turmoil, today when they lacked even private resources to withstand the loss, it was absolutely necessary. But Chanticleer grew conscious of the 1,000 watchful eyes and the silence. He stiffened on his branch. He raised his head higher and higher, while thoughts seemed to whirl behind his eyes. Like a ramrod went his back. Defensive was the tension in his wings. His glance shot everywhere over the congregation of the animals. Then he opened his beak, and he crowed. But he didn't crow to heaven. He crowed like fire against the animals. He crowed, "What have I ever done to you?" And they were smitten. This was not the crow of grief. It was as though the earth had opened up beneath their feet. "See," sang the worms, tumultuous in his mind, "isn't it worse than a dream, and worse than all your imagining?" The cock was raising his head from the sleep that had not come to him. He'd felt, before he heard it, the dying of all sound around him, and a growing silence. And when he looked, he saw a horror. Everywhere the animals of his ruling stood still, stock still, and all of them were gazing directly at him. He was the center of their staring, as though he were an alien suddenly dropped among them. "What do you suppose, Cock, this trial is about?" sang the vindicated worms. "Why do you suppose they turn on you? What is the accusation behind 1,000 eyes? Do you think it's gone to hatred yet? Or is it mere distaste? And how will you argue their goodness now? There is not," shrilled the worms in unholy jubilation, racking his soul with the blatant proofs of it. "There is not a one among them who does not know what you have done." Mice and hens, and by the cliff lay Pertolote, the humble sheep, and all the birds of the air, and squirrels, and cats, and goats, and deer, all of them stared silently at him, and him alone. So then, he was in exile after all, judged publicly for all his sins. "When will they bring out the stones?" sang the worms. "When will they show you the execution of their conspiracy and stone you? Finally, Cock, at the bottom of things, this is the truth that controls the universe: that everyone hurt hurts back, that everyone cuts back and double. And it has a name," cried the worms inside of him. "Its name is chaos." But Chanticleer fought the maundering worms. He tried to find one thought to refute them, one refuge from the horror they insisted. But this was the only thought that the rooster could think and believe, that he hadn't sinned against these. Not these, at least not all of these. He hadn't cut them all. He didn't deserve the condemnation of them all. That wasn't just. And so he crowed a bloody, desperate defense. "What have I ever done to you?" And the worms sang, "What? What? Did you think there is justice in chaos?" The wind blew. The wolves howled, tightening the circle. The animals lay down in misery. And no one, not even the quick-eyed Pertolote, saw that the rooster in their midst had begun to cry. Chanticleer cried with harsh, unsatisfying sobs. Two things grieved him. He had never in all his life felt so totally isolated, not even when he'd been alone, because loneliness is not rejection. Behold, he was despised by his own, an outcast. And then this, he was learning a cruel lesson. Against his will, he was admitting a truth which destroyed every good and dear belief in the world, and which called every holy thing a lie. Everyone cuts back and double. Then love is a deception. Chanticleer was mourning the loss of his innocence, and of love, and of his God. This is why he never crowed the crows again, though he never ceased to cherish them. And this is why the lonely rooster wept. Heaven is empty. Chapter 45. Besieged. Animals began to desert him. Chanticleer was not surprised. It was in their natures to be self-serving. Only he hadn't truly believed that there was an organized conspiracy until now. He had denied that thought as an exaggeration and paranoia. But the goats came to him in a body. "Here!" they brayed with the tremulo of the insulted. "Look here!" they bleated, their eyes on high for having suffered such an affront. "We're leaving, see?" They stamped and shook their beards. "Little mice to govern us, of the tribes of Hophni and Phineas. Ha!" Chanticleer looked down on them, the thing itself, bare, unaccommodated selfishness. Beasts. They were no friends of his. He knew it. It was all one. "There's a problem," he said. "Food's the problem," they brayed back at him. "Fraud's the problem. We're not such as likes to be lied to, and we had a peek at your marvelous stores of food. It wasn't a sweet thing in it, not a tasty bite for any beast, and surely not for the tribes. Roots, rinds, and grasses. Ha! Till then we believed you had our interests at heart, till our little peek. But now we're going to the wolves. How do you like that?" Chanticleer narrowed his eye at them. "What is this?" he said. "What do you mean?" "Mean gone," said the goats. "Gone! We shake off the dust of this place. Mean going where we get some dignity, respect." "What do you mean the wolves?" said Chanticleer. "Ha! Everyone knows what wolves means, Lord and General of all. Ha!" They took a thoroughly nasty delight in news he didn't know. It was their superiority. "When the change comes, it won't be a rooster high and mighty. Oh, niggardly gets its comeuppance. That's what wolves means. Starve a stomach, pay the price. No one oppresses the salt of the earth forever. They rise when there's nothing to lose. That's what wolves means." Chanticleer leaned forward from his branch, worms sliding from his tear ducts, worms causing a contumely within him. "Conspiracy." "You made it up," he hissed. "Oh," they said in mock surprise. "Oh, we didn't know we had such powers. Out of our heads comes wolf howls all night long to scarify the stupid creatures round us. Or maybe that's just tummy rumbles from being hungry." "Wolves howl, that means nothing," hissed the rooster. And the goats were positively gleeful. This distress was beyond their expectations, yet every bit what they deserved. "Wolves howl," they bray. "Wolves talk, and only the ignorant don't know what they say. And it ain't our names in the night wind, rooster. They don't fling our reputations abroad. Ha! 2 guesses who." Chanticleer's silence, then, they took for defeat. Oh, they had brought him down, and as they trooped away, they nattered loudly, "Cut me from here to here, ha! Puncture my neck, ha! Bold is as bold does." At the woods they turned for one last jeer. "The name is Chanticleer." So, the wolves then. It's the wolves will rebel against him. Not everyone who cuts was cut first. Some just take advantage where they can, so. But he would meet them. If it came to that, let them try their cut. Then he would show them the law of the universe. Chanticleer thought that he would wait on them, grim under a hard gray sky, resting until he had to fight. And then he would glory in the use of gaff and the slasher finally. The righteous fight would feel so good. But while he hunched into an attitude of wary patience, another creature came with the temerity to talk to him. There was no scorn in her voice. There never could be. She was a hen of humility, and the talk was not easy for her. Therefore the worms had nothing to say regarding her, and behold, he listened. But she too mentioned the wolves. And since he was allowed one final moment of affection, Lord Chanticleer determined to be not altogether passive, but to enact a love, even if it had no purpose whatsoever. He would go, even now, and bury Mundocani. He would honor that dog, he alone, the separated dog, the separated rooster. It was right. Ah, thought little Chalcedony as she crept to the hemlock, he was a gaunt rooster after all, and he seemed to her eye so terribly tired. He fairly hung across his limb. He glanced at her, and she fell instantly into a curtsy, but he looked away again. His comb clutched one side of his head like a dead leaf. The travelling had ruined him. Then how could she talk to him? But she thought, brazen it through, Chalcedony, speak or leave. She spoke. "Animals said 'twould do no good, me talking to you," she hollered, "but I made bold to say it couldn't do no harm neither, and I made bold to come." Whew, this was a trial for her. The rooster did not acknowledge her presence, and she found herself jacking up and down in endless curtsies. "It's that important," she said, "and why? Well, you know there's hardly no food no more," she said, popping up and down. But I don't never mind that. I can skip snacks, sir. But the others has needs, and their needs are increasin', and if they scratch the ice from hunger, don't you know? But I guess you know. But I never mind that neither, and they can go their way, and I'll go mine." She was nearly out of breath, and still he wasn't looking at her, and still she hadn't made her point. She'd come to make a point. "It's the wolves, sir," she muttered, casting one-eyed glances at the rooster. She had to keep him in the half-vision left to her, which meant she kept cocking her head sideways, a fumbling way to talk. "The wolves are coming round where the child and me stand a sort of watch on her father. There's one that glares with a red eye. It's an ungodly red. No, I don't like that red, and it's Black Pale he's looking at." Suddenly the rooster lifted his head and fixed her with a stare. This was not better, this was worse. The stare made her so self-conscious, and she was a gimpy hen, and blind in one eye, unworthy to bring her suit to him. But the point was so important. She found herself shouting, "But I don't even never mind the wolf, sir. A wolf's no devilment in himself, it's the tooth. He's got a tooth with a fracture that runs from the cusp to the gum. A drooling yellow tooth, sir, and what does he mean to do with it? There's the question." The rooster was focused on her now, was looking intensely at her, and that's what she wanted, but what a trouble it caused in her heart. He whispered, "Chalcedony," he said, "my hen, my poor anemic—" She shouted on, "I don't never mind the tooth neither. Oh, it's the egg. For once in her life, Chalcedony has a child to love. One poor egg made it to hatching, don't you see? One baby made it to me, but what kind of loving is it if Chalcedony can't keep the horrors away? Don't you see? Please see. The fawn shouldn't cry no more, not any more in the whole wide world, on account of she has cried enough, because I don't know why, but her papa died. There shouldn't be a wolf come troubling her now. There shouldn't come that tooth to frighten her. Her papa died, sir, died, and do you know what sadness it is to see the poor fawn sad?" The rooster spread his wings and sank to the snow in front of Chalcedony, still gazing at her. "Crow, sir, she cried. "Please give a crow, sir, as'll send a wolf away." He silenced her absolutely with a touch to her face. My own Chalcedony," he whispered. He flummoxed her. He turned her head until she could not see him, for he took the blind side, and then she almost slipped to the ground because he put the tip of his tongue to her eyeball. She felt both breath and the warmth. Blind eyes can feel. As quiet as the snow and mortally tired, he said, "What happened to your eye, Chalcedony?" Blind eyes can also cry. What could she say to such a question, and all the feelings rushing through her? Nothing. She covered her face, both eyes between her wings, and she cried. "Does it hurt?" he whispered. She shook her head. "Is that why you are crying?" the rooster whispered. She shook her head. "Then why are you crying?" It was the old, old voice of her Lord Chanticleer, and it waited her answer. Oh, why was she crying? Such no-account behavior now? Because she had not made the rooster to understand, for all her trying, and she blamed her tongue that couldn't keep on course. Because if the rooster wouldn't know, then there was no help nowhere in all the world for little children, and there were horrors to come, and none to stop them. But why was she crying? Because she could hardly bear the weariness in her lord, nor the sight of his suffering, nor his touch. She whined as truly as she could. I don't know I am crying, sir. The rooster whispered, My poor, poor hen Chalcedony. She looked, and in his eye too was a tear. That was a marvel. For a moment the crippled hen and the lord of the land looked upon one another in perfect understanding, and they were equal. All of their ghosts stood back. All of the Furies fell silent. Chalcedony felt that she was lovely. Chanticleer felt at peace. One moment, one tranquil moment. This moment was for both of them a benediction, and they loved each other. But the wolves howled. The light was dying around them. Chalcedony went to her child and the need that wanted her there. Chanticleer dislodged the skull of Mundocani and bore it away to bury it. Chapter 46. They asked his name and he said no one. Ferric Coyote had no intentions of waking up. In a half-stupor, it seemed to him that he could choose to stay oblivious forever, to shrink and shrink to nothingness. He could be the candle flame that blew out. This father had no right to be. But someone was nuzzling his body, and he began to feel his own ribs truly, and he resisted. He groaned, No, no. That's how he resisted. He was helpless to do any more than groan. The nuzzling, warm and moist, the nuzzling grew stronger against his side, and he felt himself to be turned onto his back. His forepaws drooped to his chest. His lower knees flopped wide apart. He squeezed his eyes shut and groaned piteously. No, no. Please, just let him pass away. But then a gentle flesh touched his lips, and his senses quickened there. The flesh just brushed below his nose, asking to come in. Ferric held his breath. Something so intimate and holy was happening that he woke with tingling, though his eyes stayed shut. He parted his lips. Lightly, deliciously, as soft as kindness, the living flesh slid into his mouth and lay upon his tongue, waiting. Ferric closed upon it. Immediately his stomach cramped with a painful hunger, and this is what Ferric did. He sucked, and the flesh gave forth a wonderful, abundant fluid. And Ferric moaned with a new sound now. He sucked hungrily. He swallowed milk, sweeter than honey, thick and good, and the milk filled every hollow of his being. It ran in streams from the flesh in his mouth to the wastes inside of him. He grew breathless. He grinned. He buried his face in the whole pillow of skin above him, and he smelled the smell of straw, and he heard a gentle lowing in the air, and he drank until he was content. As the flesh was drawn from his mouth, he opened his eyes. He saw the ample udder of a cow, and the one nipple that had been his own. And then he saw the face of the dun cow herself. She swung round to look at him. He smiled like a silly baby, and then he shuddered almost to weeping. For her eye was a deep pool into which the whole of Ferric Coyote might sink. Oh, what a dear and loving thing to be gathered into that gaze! She had filled him with her intimate gift. Now she embraced him with her sympathy, and he was warmed within and without, and he did not know what to say. Ferric trembled and wept. Was he worthy to be healed by such a holy one? Down she lay beside him. Against his neck she nudged her muzzle, and he felt it, and he sighed. Then she bathed him. Stroke for stroke she washed him with her tongue, as though he were new-born. From the corners of his eyes, down his sides, to the joint of his tail, and everywhere private upon him, she cleansed the coyote, and he was not ashamed. Infants are never ashamed. Ferric lay small, in a perfect infancy, loving with all his heart the tongue and the touch of the dun cow. He wept tears of absolute relief. These too she licked away. It was the night. At the beginning of this night, Ferric Coyote had admitted an utter helplessness, and that was a terrible thing, like death. Despair, defeat, and death. But see what the dear dun cow had done to helplessness? She consecrated it. She turned it into infancy, and that is a hopeful, holy thing, like the beginning of life. It was the night, and he worshipped the lowing of the dun cow. When she lay still beside him, he said, "Did you ever know Rachel?" With an infinite eye she looked at him. Yes, she had known Rachel. He said, "Ah," in speechless gratitude, and then he said, "Benoni, did you know Benoni too?" She had known Benoni too. "He was my son," said Ferric. "He was your son." "He loved me." "He did, and you loved him." Ferric said, "Ah, yes, yes, yes." And then the soul of the coyote rested indeed, and he was comforted. For if his wife and his child were known of this Holy One, then they were safe forever. It was the night. Presently the dun cow heaved herself to standing, and she walked toward the steps of the canyon, and she descended, going toward his home. Ferric, too, stood up on his unpracticed limbs. He followed her. Twill stood back in childish awe when they came down, not wagging her tail. She let her mouth drop open, but the dun cow lowed to her, and she squeaked to be spoken to. The child gave an instant trust to this figure with one horn on her head, and Ferric was glad. The brown bird popped from the den, questioning things by the switching of her bill. The dun cow paused a long time in front of her, and both of the women went quiet. They communicated, neither one using a tongue. Ferric felt the sacred sigh of their communication, like a covenant slowly compacted, though he could not understand it, nor interfere. Then the dun cow did an uncommon thing. One by one she bent her forelegs underneath herself, and so bowed down before the bird. Ferric shivered. If this was veneration, then that bird of the broken wing was one of the holy ones too. Little Ferric, what revelations he was privy to this night. And finally she did what she had come to do. Hopsacking was sleeping. The dun cow drew her from the den and ministered unto her, and this was more merciful kindness for Ferric than all the ministrations that he had himself received, because he said, "She is Rachel's daughter." If Hopsacking did not die, then Ferric was forgiven. He was given a daughter again, in spite of himself and his neglect. He was given a daughter for the first time again, and with Hopsacking's life came Rachel's, because he said, "This is Rachel's child." He would never doubt the darkness again, nor death in that darkness. And what could be dangerous if it could not kill? Nothing. With what yearning, then, he watched, while the dun cow turned the poor limp body to its back, its forehead and nose on the ice and its mouth agape. Then down lay the cow to curve around the child, and since one thigh was on the ground, her udders spilled out. One nipple touched the baby's tongue. Ferric waited. Then Ferric praised the instincts of babies. She closed her mouth and began to suck, and Ferric knew what she was feeling. He giggled. He laughed out loud. He said, "Did I tell you that this is the daughter of Rachel?" He laughed with an aching gladness, and when the baby dropped the nipple with a smack and a spasm of sighing, and when he saw that she was truly sleeping, because it was a milk of remarkable nourishment. That's when he began again to cry. The dun cow washed the stringy body of Hopsacking, causing her fur to stand up and make her look ridiculous. And then she fed Twill, and she washed her too, and Twill helped. She was the only one awake to know what goodness she was receiving from the angel of God. Ferric slept soundly the rest of the night, his snout stuck out of the den. This was so he could watch. No one else was in the den with him. The women had gathered together in the hill which was the dun cow. 2 cubs, a bird, a cow. The women. Finally, it was the women and the children who shared by nature the foundation of a faith, because faith begins in weakness, and though every creature is weak, it is the women who are willing to admit it. All night long the dun cow lowed in a voice as deep as the planets. By morning she was gone. By morning, too, they were a family again, flushed with sudden good health, and it seemed to Ferric that the sun might shine. "She talked to you, didn't she?" he said to Twill. "It's 2 that talks to me now," Twill said happily. "What did she say?" he said. "What did she tell you in the night?" "That she loved you, Papa." Ferric said, "Ah." Ferric grinned like a silly baby and said, "Ah." "And that she loved another one as well as you," said Twill. She screwed her face up in a trouble of not understanding. "She said he's sick now. She said he's terribly sick, but she wishes he was well. She said that if you go to him, Papa, and forgive him the same way she forgived you, then he would be well, just the same as you. Mostly she said that she hoped you would go. No, she said she knew you would, on account of how brave you are." "Ah," said Ferric Coyote, overwhelmed to be entrusted with such a duty. "Papa?" "What?" "His name is Chanticleer." 47. Red in tooth and claw. Night. Black Pale's body was cool to the touch. The Fawn de la Cour's too hot. She would stretch her neck toward her father, even as she backed away, part of her wanting to lick him, part of her frightened of the thing inside him, death. The stag lay still. The fawn could not settle. She could not sleep. His eyes were knit shut. Hers rolled in bewilderment. Night. And the hen Chalcedony could only watch the halting drama, waiting for the child to tire. She stood in the darkness, apart, because she didn't belong between them. This was private. What could she do? This was a private and personal struggle, and it was the night. Suddenly she felt that they were not 2 living creatures on the Liverbrook, but 3. What was it? A snort? A breath? The heat of another body? Or deadness in the sound behind her? Chalcedony whirled and stared with one eye in the blackness, looking for form or some sort of motion, but all of the shadows merged, falling into the dark. Then all at once she saw him, and the thought skimmed her mind. He wasn't howling. I didn't hear him howl. She would have screamed, but there wasn't time. Charging up the Liverbrook on sock feet like the cat, but his head low down, and his tail too, and his lips curled, fangs clashing between them, came Notos, the midnight wolf. He was silent now. His eyes were mad red, bleeding greed. Immediately Chalcedony flew in the face of the fawn, making her flinch backward. So the fawn and the hen sprawled in the snow, but the wolf in one smooth leap sailed over them and landed at the stag's belly. Delacour said, "Auntie, what?" But Chalcedony knew what instantly. She screamed, "Leave us alone!" But Notos spread his jaws and sank his teeth into the flesh of the great stag. His throat emitted a savage, wretched snarling, and she could see his snout wrinkled by the hugeness of the bite. He jerked. He gathered his paws beneath him and jerked backward, now, trying to rip the skin free. The stag slid toward the wolf, his great head turning up. "Papa!" shrieked Delacour. "Aye!" sang Chalcedony in a perfect delirium of rage. Absolutely mindless of herself, the little hen took to her wings and threw herself at the wolf. She beat his head with her wings. She scratched at his eyes with her claws. She caused a furious inconvenience all round his face, but he only shut his eyes behind thick fur and yanked the harder. When she heard skin pop and tear, and when it seemed to her that the dead stag groaned, the blood shot through her temples. Up on her wings the poor hen rose, horrified at the abomination. Down she came on the wolf's rump, and for once in her life the claw was not crippled. Both claws, 8 nails like the talons of the eagles, pierced wolf butt and fastened to him. Notos brought his head up with a little woof, truly surprised. It was as though he hadn't realized that anyone else was near him. For a second he whined like an innocent, and then anger flooded him, and he twisted his head left and right to snap at the hen. She was silent. She was only just hanging on. The wolf bucked twice, whipping her head backward, but Chalcedony hung on. Round and round he ran, chasing the affliction at his tail, howling both hurt and anger. Chalcedony was afraid now, because this body was so much stronger than she'd anticipated. It was a lethal engine dragging her into dizziness. But there was no letting go now. She concentrated only to keep her claws in the wolf muscle, and she hung on. Suddenly he bowed his head and ran flat out, southward into the blackness. She felt the wind. She cracked with the kick of his hind legs. She heard a distant Delacour wail, "Auntie!" and she came to the cruel conclusion that she was going to die. Her toes ached. The nails were slipping. She said, in the still part of her mind, "Soon, soon now." In a field of ghostly snow, Chalcedony let go. She somersaulted like a clumsy hen, and then lay still. The wolf hurtled 20 yards before digging himself to a stop. He turned. It was a purely malevolent eye that he laid on her, red at 20 paces, and the growl that played in his throat made the whole world clear. He was going to bite, kill, and eat a hen, and that was the way she was going to die. Chalcedony did not so much as move. There was no protest in her, nor did the prospect seem all that wrong. Life had grown too troublesome for a crippled hen. Then let it go. Just let it go. At the instant he launched himself, she thought of the fawn, and sadness swept her. She began to say aloud, "But why mayn't Chalcedony have a child like—" Snow blew up like smoke around the wolf's lunging. One could hardly see the other lean black body between Chalcedony and him. One could barely hear the utterly fearless threat, "John gives you what for?" As in a dream, the hen watched John Wesley Weasel flatten himself to the ground directly in front of Notos. When the wolf drove over him, then the weasel thrust upward like a dagger for the throat, in a flash taking his own bite, closing his jaws on the windpipe. And the wolf ran on, a black strap hanging from his neck. As in a dream, Chalcedony saw the wolf's red eyes pass over her, widened now with their own knowledge, and the mouth gaping and soundless and breathing nothing. Dreamlike, Notos spun into a dance of horrible beauty, leaping, beseeching heaven, finally lying on the earth as though that were the place for him after all, actually curling down for sleep. 3 separate spasms for air, and then the black wolf Notos was still. The weasel let go. The wolf sighed long, but it was only the giving up of the ghost. When John Wesley came toward her, Chalcedony saw with a certain wonder that the weasel was limping too, that his left hind leg was useless. He put his small eyes near her, sniffing the scents. Belatedly she began to tingle as the events crashed in on her, and she thought she was about to cry, but she still did not move. "Hey, Chickie!" said the weasel. "Is Chickie okay, what?" She simply fell to shivering. The weasel whispered in a darker voice, "What the hell's the matter hereabouts?" And he said, "Why come a Chickie she gots to fights a wolf? Why comes a wolf he fights a Chickie? And why come John he gots to be a murderer?" She shook her head. She didn't know. She didn't know. It was all too troublesome to understand, too many for Chalcedony. "Hey, Chickie," he whispered. "It's okay, Chickie. No, don't be worried, Chickie, on account of John." Two crippled creatures in a field of snow, and in the night, and wordless ignorance, two who felt so tiny in the universe. When they rose to limp home, they saw the gray wolf, Chinook, watching them. Poor John sighed and raised his back to combat posture all over again. But Chinook of the blue eye said, he was the maverick. As faithful as the wheel, she said, he deserved the execution, weasel. And she said, if you came to us, we would not turn you away. John Wesley said with honest feelings, "But why come John he gots to be the executioner? John fights, but did somebody thinks that John he likes to kill buggers with fur like him on his own self? No. And so they passed her in sorrow.